Okay, this is lecture 4. Um, After trying it out on the board this morning, I thought it would be better if I just brought it back to the computer and do it my normal way. Um, Obviously, looking at this, you saw this morning. It blew up first period. Um, we are in an age of what we call narrowcasting. And with narrowcasting, you have programming that is specifically targeted to a certain audience. So MTV is targeted to somebody young, um, Fox News to conservatives, MSNBC to liberals, the Food Network to foodies, Spike to men, Oprah for women, etc., etc. And I think when we look at an adage. We could say food for political thought is growing, but the appetite is decreasing. So what that means is there's more available, and yet we're taking less of it. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I assume it's a bad thing because if you're not doing anything with the availability of the abundance of things that we have, then it becomes an interesting dilemma for those who are trying to bring product to you. Now, when we look at media bias, this is from the FAIR, which is a very left-wing progressive organization. They make the claim that media citations by ideology leave the left at a disadvantage, that things are geared toward what conservatives, but especially those in the center, need. Um, I don't see a lot to back that up, but the media does attack based on what you're watching. So Fox will go after the left, MSNBC goes after the right. Um, there are all different sorts of biases. Um, you just have to be aware that's the game that they play. And in many cases, it's not necessarily a bad game. They're trying to attract a certain type of audience, and they do it really well. Now we see here with this um, that Fox News dominates the right, and so its media bias comes from trying to serve an audience that it definitely skews to conservatives. Meanwhile, MSNBC and NBC and ABC and CBS skew to the left in trying to uh, serve, geez, a much smaller audience, because we know that liberals are pretty much about 1 out of 5, whereas conservatives are and moderates are certainly about 2 out of 5 each. It must be very difficult for a left-wing organization to deal with these kind of numbers. And you can see why MSNBC is the left-wing version of Fox Right. Now we also know that journalism plays a tough, or the journalistic history plays certainly makes for a key role in how the news is portrayed. So we see here that this comes from the Kaiser Foundation, the role of polls in public policy making. It's from 2001. It's probably even more skewed now. But we see that, especially with journalists, about 1 out of 4 claim that they're Democrat, and over half claim that they're independent. But I just have a hard time thinking that those numbers are still relevant. Partly the number of Democrats have went up, the number of independents have went down, maybe the number of Republicans have went up slightly. And maybe you have a larger group of people who say you don't need to know my background, just listen to what I say. Policymakers, again, skew more to the Democrats, but you see that Republicans rapidly gain traction and is almost independent of, or almost equal to those who are independent. And then when it comes to the public, it's again very, it's changed, because now we know that virtually Democrats and Republicans are about equal, and independents have been growing, and independents are now in the upper 20% of how people look at themselves politically. And then when we look at self-described ideology, again, liberals dominate the journalistic field, the policymaker field, and do not dominate the public field. Their numbers are pretty much spot on at 21, 22%. And so remember, you have to do this driving question, post it on Google Classroom. Why do you think journalists identify as independent in a far greater percentage than policymakers or the public? And it's a driving question. So what have you picked up about ideology from your book and other sources in order to provide an answer for me? Now, we're throwing stuff in here as we go. So these are two vocabulary words. One is beat. And so if you look to the picture on the right, the Pentagon is a beat. And what that means is this is where that reporter spends time. It can be the White House, it can be Capitol Hill, it can be the State Department, you name it. That's their beat. That's what they report on. Now, trial balloons are simply figuratively a smoke signal that goes up, and you see which way the wind is blowing, and you basically ask the question, well, what if we did this? And you do it in order to gauge how people will react to a proposal like that. Many times you find the field fertile, and many of the times people are like, really? Do you really think you can do that? And so you move on to something else. But beat and trial balloons are two things that you need to know as words for vocabulary in Chapter 7. Now, I'm looking for copies of the New York Times, and that would be in the fiction section. That's what many on the right say about the New York Times, whereas on the left, the New York Times is God. And it's probably somewhere in between, but I think it's generally considered that the New York Times isn't the paper that it used to be. So the New York Times leans left. They definitely leave out news or bury news in the back of the first section of the paper when it's something that they don't like or they don't feel they need to spend time on, even though other venues, even some competitors, are making a big play of it. So there's very little in the New York Times right now about Jonathan Gruber, which is a big deal on Fox. And there was very little on Andrew Tamarici, the Marine who got arrested in Mexico. While it was big on Fox, it was very little news about it in a lot of other venues. So we know that many people believe the news favors one point of view over another. We know that's true with Fox, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times. So what generally people believe is generally true. But sometimes it's a little bit more deceptive because it's not based along liberal or conservative lines, but it's based on what they think their readers are looking for. So the New York Times, which skews left, is basically priming stories for those types of, or those people in the audience who believe as the editor and the publisher and the reporting staff do.
Please excuse interruption. Just a reminder, tomorrow will be a regular school day. Dismissal time will be at 2:41. Friday will be the minimum day. School getting out at 1:08. Thank you.
And I think I will leave that announcement in there instead of editing it out, because that way you won't forget what tomorrow is. Now, the media has what's known as an agenda-setting function. The issues that attract the serious attention of public officials and others in policymaking is what we call a policy agenda. Meanwhile, the policy entrepreneurs are people who invest political capital in the issue. So you saw names bandied around in this recent election cycle. The Democrats attacked the Koch brothers. The Republicans were mentioning Tom Steyer and George Soros. Doesn't matter where you're coming from, the left or right. Policy entrepreneurs depend on good images and goodwill in order to get their issues known and to be treated with some seriousness by the public. So the policy agenda of many of these policy entrepreneurs cross each other. So Tom Steyer is pushing climate change. The Koch brothers are pushing more conservative issues, and so on and so forth. So, but you need to know those two things: policy agenda and policy entrepreneur. Now, the sources of the media: interpreting and socializing. To read this, the power to set the context, to frame the issue, to interpret the facts, and potentially to provide legitimacy for people, issues, or groups are powerful and controversial functions of the media. It is. They have three roles. One, of course, is the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper determines what issues are going to be brought, or what they think the important issues are that should be brought before the public. The watchdog role is going after people or going on about issues that they think haven't been treated, or people haven't been treated fairly. A scorekeeper basically is who's winning, who's losing. And we see scorekeeping come up on important issues. So, for instance, if the Keystone Pipeline bill comes out of the Senate and the House and it arrives on the president's desk, will he sign it or not? If he signs it, then people like Tom Steyer and the environmentalists on the far left will feel like they're losers, and they will be looked at that from that perspective by the press. Meanwhile, oil companies, cheap energy groups, unions will be made to feel like they're winners because they were heard by the president, and there are some expectations that there will be more jobs and things like that. We also know that media is an agent of socialization. Unfortunately, when we talk about socialization, we think that it's Facebook and Instagram and all of that. But media can do much greater things. For me, the socialization from media occurs when I read Real Clear Politics. It teaches me about political facts, things that, since I can't subscribe to every magazine out there, pertinent articles appear out of those magazines, and their explanation of issues help me form opinions, and then that helps me present to you the type of data in which you can make your own opinions. And I know that I get passionate about certain things. I'm certainly passionate about the coming constitutional crisis that we have over the use of executive orders and executive agreements, but it's something that is derived from the fact that I'm able to grasp the political facts pretty well, and they generate a response in me. Now, same thing, agenda setting. The media's ability to determine which issues will be covered. Again, that is the gatekeeper. And conversely, deciding which stories are not news is also acting as the gatekeeper. So it's both a positive and a negative. Now, issue framing could be in a lot of ways the job of the gatekeeper, but it can also be the job of the watchdog, and the job of the scorekeeper. In again, as I explained with the Keystone Pipeline, how the issue is framed and what happens to it, we can determine winners and losers. So we know that, for instance, issue framing, if we look at the November 4th midterms, the Democrats were losers and the Republicans were winners. Could very well be different in 2016, but we don't know. It's 2 years away and lots of stuff will happen. And the same way, issue framing, agenda setting, just another way of looking at how public opinion is influenced by both the issue framing and by the agenda setting. So you should probably write these down. And again, write down gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and watchdog. Now here, of course, is the Kennedy-Nixon debate. Kennedy on the left, Nixon on the right. Panel of questioners. And again, remember that debates aren't the way they're really supposed to be. It's not a free-for-all, which I think it should be. I think it would certainly make things more interesting. But it is what it is right now because people are terrified that they'll make some sort of mistake while they're in the middle of a debate, and things will never be the same again for their campaign. Now, when it comes to the choice of candidates, since Clinton did this in 1992, he appeared on Arsenio Hall's show with his saxophone and played. It seemed like he was really cool and all of that. This was during the primary season. Now, even when you're president, you try to get on Letterman or Leno or Oprah or whatever, and they try to, in essence, be themselves and be cool and calm and edgy and things like that. You know, it is what it is. Now, how does the media affect campaigns? Well, the media determines who the front-running candidates are, and I told you today in class about the 1992 campaign in which Clinton was already struggling with accusations of infidelity, and he and Mrs. Clinton, a couple days before the election, appeared on 60 Minutes. Sorry about that. And Clinton, who was down at the polls at the time, put on a very strong performance along with his wife that night. And when the votes were counted a couple days later in the New Hampshire primary, he finished second. But because he'd come back from being so low in the polls, he was actually considered the winner that night, even though someone else finished first. And that was the determination of the press, to treat Clinton as the victor rather than the person who finished first. It's kind of sad. They also charge for advertising. And charging for advertising is one way that they make a profit. That's what they do. They also televise debates, and they portray the more charismatic politicians as the more electable person. And we call this is kind of an important thing. Now, on the right is a chart on where the public learns about the presidential campaigns, and consequently, we see that there's been a shift away from local TV news, from cable news, from the nightly news, from newspapers to more cable news network orientation, but also the internet, and that's where the huge growth is occurring, and that's very telling as to the continuing move to the net that politicians and campaigns will take in the coming decade. Now, technology has also become an extremely important part of media and campaigns. So with the web, citizens now have an opportunity many times to interact with each other on a wide range of politics. You know, whenever I post something on Facebook or something like that, I'll get some responses, some good or bad. And what also media is important for is making an image. So in this election cycle, early on in June, there was a pretty good commercial that came from Joni Ernst about how she, as growing up as a girl, castrated pigs, and when she went to Washington, she was going to essentially put a stop on the amount of pork that's being spent, taxpayer dollars as pork. As you can see here in the right-hand corner, Barack Obama was looked at as a family man. Abe Lincoln Abe was a rail splitter. The media has an impact on voter choice because if you look at these four things here, personality over substance, the horse race, negative advertising, all those take precedent over information about the issues. The first three are much more important. And personality over substance, unfortunately, seems to be the biggest, or one of the biggest qualifiers for a person being elected or not. And that's really sad. Just really sad. It should be the last one, information about issues. Also, the media can make an impact on voter choice by making a decision on election night reporting. Remember, there's a 3-hour difference between and sometimes a 4-hour difference between polls in the East, maybe sometimes a 5-hour difference, because if Kentucky closes at 6 o'clock, it's still 3 o'clock in California, and we don't close our polls until 8. The media can influence us by exit poll reporting results early on. It is interesting that where sometimes people tune out news, the fact that if an election is called early, like it was in 1980, people in the West don't go out and vote, and that was partly the fault of Carter, but it was also the fault of the press making such demonstrable decisions about who was winning early on. Now, when policies are being formulated and implemented, decision makers are at their most impressionable, and that's many times when they show up on Meet the Press, or they're interviewed by pundits from any of the cable news or the regular news networks. And sometimes critics contend that the media's pressuring policy makers to provide immediate answers forces them to make hasty and not good decisions. And so maybe everybody needs to take a breath to see how the thoughts about a bill or thoughts about a decision will play out before they actually put that bill or they make that decision, and it becomes a law, or it becomes something that they can't turn around. Now we know that the president, through the electronic throne, garners the most attention through the bully pulpit. He or she speaks through a press secretary or press conferences. The coverage of the president is generally unfavorable if it's a Republican, much more favorable if it's a Democrat. Sorry about that, but that seems to be the way it is right now. Congress's 535 members pose a challenge because they speak with multi-voices, whereas the president's administration speaks with one voice. The coverage of Congress is also generally negative. The Supreme Court, because it doesn't allow cameras into the courtroom, is more private, and therefore the coverage is much more limited. Though Supreme Court officials may issue press releases, it doesn't have the same effect as when you're dealing with the legislative or executive branches. Other types of officials may issue press conferences, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. They may hold briefings. They may have some conferences that they attend that reporters also attend. They may speak to reporters on the plane there while walking from one office to another. Reporters or the media can also get information off the record, which means that please don't quote me, but this is what I think is going to hear. And in 1964, this is one of the cases I think you did this summer, the New York Times v. Sullivan. It set the libel boundaries up pretty high. So if you're a public figure, you really have almost no chance, unless it's just so scurrilous that it couldn't be true. You almost have no chance of winning if you're a celebrity or a politician and you sue. Now we can see here that the number of press conferences, look at that, 981 press conferences held by Roosevelt, albeit that he was in the presidency for 13 years, but still that's well over, that's just a little under 100 press conferences a year. And then we can see that Eisenhower had 193, Kennedy with only 65. You would think that he would have had a lot more, even if his presidency was only 2.5 years, because he enjoyed the give and take with the press. But only 65. It bumps up with Johnson, and then it continues to hover for the next 12, 13 years. Hovers in the double digits, and then goes back up with George Bush and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and then has fallen with President Obama. Now, you can look at this key terms later. I just want to go over a couple things, and you can write this down verbally. When we look at the interaction of the media and politics, we have to look at what campaign coverage does. So I'm going to give you a list of things. It's in the order of what we call declining importance. And it's the types of campaign news when we look at the campaign coverage. So the most often talked about type of coverage is that of strategy planning, and that means that there's a discussion of campaign strategies by the talking heads, anybody who's a newsreader. And that's followed by the horse racing image and the perception of the campaign as a competition. You would think, though, in this last election, or the last couple of elections, that the horse race problem has gotten more importance than the strategy planning problem. So, but we'll stick right now with strategy planning number 1, horse race number 2. Third is the hoopla, or the excitement, and that means that you cover exciting events. But the problem is that the events now are so managed that the excitement is gone for most of us. We look at it on the screen and go, well, whatever. But that's the third thing. The fourth thing is the discussion, or the campaign coverage of real issues, a discussion of substantive campaign issues. It occasionally does happen on certain programs. It's very much something that happens. Then candidate character. They could be talking about the revelations on the attributes or the flaws of different politicians. And then the polling results, which is very closely tied to the horse racing image. The reporting of poll results and the analysis then gets tied in with who's behind, who's ahead, which is not surprising. Then they might go out on the man on the street, the common man interviews, and they interview potential voters. What are they thinking? Will they come out and vote? So on and so forth. After that, current political events or actions, and we link the candidates and campaigns to breaking events. So in 2012, there was Chris Christie walking with President Obama after the hurricane struck New Jersey. That would be an example. Usually the White House and events that affect the campaign our campaigns are much more visible than the types of breaking events and campaign candidates that are associated with them. And that association is that with Congress. Congress is always going to get less visibility. And then the media usage. You see it not a lot, but you'll see Fox talking about what MSNBC is talking about, or MSNBC pointing out what Fox is talking about. Usually on the Sunday morning shows like Meet the Press, Face the Nation, you have what we call expert commentary, and you get analysis by political experts. What's that? What is that? 10, 11? It's way down there. It's way down there. Wow. And then after that, there's PAC journalism. PAC journalism is simply the homogenation of reports, the reporting of politicians' statements, not asking any questions about if what is being said is right or wrong, the repeating of other reporters' statements, again, without assessing if they're right or wrong. A dedicated effort by news reporters to avoid manipulation by the candidates or the parties is farther down. So fewer reports occur when a pre-staged event has been given, and they're more or less more of an avoidance of the use of sound bites. So it's an interesting process, and I'm going to do one more lecture, and I'll do that quickly tonight, and we'll look at general government news reporting, and that should be pretty quick, and then we'll look at the views on the media, and we'll be done. We'll be ready to look at the test, and I'm probably going to give you at least a partial test tomorrow to look at. So that's the end of lecture 4. Tomorrow, a little bit of review. If I'm feeling uncomfortable, it may be that I slip the multiple choice to Friday and we come back and do the free response that Monday, or I give it to you and you've got to do it maybe the Sunday before. We come after Thanksgiving, but the Sunday before we come back. I might do that. But either way, or both of them are going to be on the Friday. We may do the free response in class, and the multiple choice will be online. I just want to make sure that you have enough time, even though we're dealing with less information. You have enough time to complete it. So this ends lecture 4.